Coffee time again, exposing the truth. Welcome to Coffee Time Again, exposing the truth. Dale at the microphone, the show that demonstrates how history repeats itself. He digs into the past, shows what happens, and how it is happening now. Follow the path of history to where it goes, then relate it to today to reveal the connections. The culture that forgets its history has no future. A history buff and loves to talk about it, going back as far as ancient Greeks and Egyptians and beyond. So grab your coffee, your chair, and listen to the show. Hope you enjoy.
Do that. That's what. Okay, well, right now, Richard, how are you today?
I'm fantastic, Dale. How are you today?
I'm doing fair to middling today. I'm not in the best shape, but so tell me a little bit about yourself and then we'll get started.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And I like the way you do your podcast. You and I had a pretty lengthy discussion several weeks ago where
Yes.
you vetted me for this podcast. So I
Yes.
hope that your listeners know
Yeah.
that you take it pretty seriously.
Oh, my listeners know. I tell them I vet I vet them because I want to know who's coming on the show, and I want to make sure that I don't care if they agree with me or disagree with me, but they're going to be civil about it. That's what I really care about. And if they want to disagree with me, that's just fine with me. I'm not here to say I'm absolutely right, but if you want to disagree with me, go ahead, but do it civilly. You can disagree with me without being disagreeable.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on and giving me an opportunity to talk about my book and about myself a little bit. So I live my name is Richard Rains. I live in Northeast Florida, and learned today we've got another hurricane bearing down on us in the next couple of days, but we're kind of used to that over here. And I do quite a few things. One of the things I do is I teach theology and world religions to college students. And as you can see, I'm in my classroom, which I've never done a podcast from my classroom. And I'm a big Georgia Bulldogs fan, and I wear my ID on a Georgia Bulldogs lanyard. So I am in professor mode right now. But I teach theology, teach world religions, history of Christianity, which is really my favorite subject to teach. And I'm a fairly new author. I've written for most of my adult life. I had a newspaper column for years. I've written several magazine articles, and I've written almost exclusively to a specifically sort of Christian crowd. I've always written within Christianity. And so during COVID, I felt compelled to write a book about George Washington. The title of the book is Finding Washington: Why America Needs to Rediscover the Virtues of Her Most Essential Founding Father. And so I wrote a book about George Washington, and it's about George Washington, but it's more for us and for how we should approach this social and cultural decline that I see that is so pervasive today. What can we learn about George Washington, and what can we learn about his virtues that can help us to become the virtuous people we need to be to really turn the tide of this social degradation that I see, Dale? That's a little bit about me, and that's the book that I've written.
Yeah. Well, I'm very interested in talking about the book, but you raised a question that I'm interested about watching, which I will get to in a minute. But I also want to let you know I am a Christian. I'm an Episcopalian, devout. So it's not going to bother me if we get into that, because I want to, because I took a course at EFM. I don't know if you know what that is.
So EFM, is that Evangelical Fellowship? Is that?
No, it's Education for Ministries.
Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't understand the reference. Yeah. No, that's is that a Episcopal sort of a lay person? No,
it actually, it's for any spiritual religious person, and any denomination's open. Well, it's mostly Episcopalian now, because it comes out of Shawnee, Tennessee Seminary. That's where it's at. It's a 4-year course, and the first year is the Old Testament. The second year is the New Testament.
Okay.
Then church history. So I had 9 months of church history in that. And then it was also 9 months. The fourth year is theology.
Okay.
So I've got a pretty good education in that area, in those two areas. Well, actually, in the New Testament and the Old Testament, although a lot of it's, my memory is getting shot at my age, but I'm more interested. But I'm more interested about George Washington. And you said something there that just tripped my trigger. And I wanted to ask you the question is, what do you consider George Washington to be the most essential of our founding fathers?
That's a really good question, Dale. And it's, believe it or not, it is not a determination that I made. It is a determination that historians, American historians, have made through the years. And I'll give you the backyard barbecue shortened version of it. But so George Washington became essential to the Continental Congress because of his wisdom. He wasn't a big public speaker. He wasn't the first person to speak, but he was one of the people instrumental in helping the other congressional, the colonists, decide to go to war. And obviously, he was the commander in chief of the army. And so when we say he is our most essential founding father, the other founding fathers rallied around George Washington because of his integrity, because of his character, and the book goes into that extensively. And but more specifically, so if you remember your American history, Dale, whenever the Revolutionary War ended, the document that governed us was the Articles of Confederation.
Yep.
Now, George Washington and a handful of people knew that this would never work. And so after the Revolutionary War, George Washington was placed on a committee. He was made the chairman of a committee to figure out if we could dig a canal from the Ohio River to the Potomac River. And so he would have meetings at Mount Vernon about this canal. Well, he and some others, James Madison, some others that were part of this committee, decided that we needed a constitutional convention to develop a federal constitution for the United States because the Articles of Confederation were not working. It was actually making it worse because you had states that could kind of do whatever they wanted. They could trade however they wanted. We had a potential rebellion up in the New England called Shays Rebellion. It's where some farmers rebelled against the state. So George Washington has the idea that he's got this group of people from every colony, essentially, not colony, but state, that's meeting at Mount Vernon to discuss this canal. He decides to bring up the idea of a constitutional convention at this meeting. He invites every state. Dale, time out. Okay, can you time out for just a second?
Yep. All right.
So he has this idea to invite all 13 of the colonies to this committee. And that meeting, Dale, the meeting to discuss building the canal, turned into the Constitutional Convention. They made George Washington the president of the Constitutional Convention, and we developed a constitution. And America, as a representative republic, was born at Mount Vernon under the leadership of George Washington, who led the Constitutional Convention and then obviously was made the first president. So
Right.
There's a lot of what ifs. You can speculate all you want to, but the fact of the matter is that without George Washington's leadership from the Revolutionary War forward, then there's a very real chance that either America would not have become a constitutional republic, or B, would have become a constitutional republic much later.
Mm-hmm.
So really, historically, the most essential founding father.
Yeah, I did not know about the connection between George Washington and Mount Vernon and the Constitutional Convention. Although I didn't know about Shays Rebellion, I knew about the Confederate Articles of Confederation, which was so bad.
Right.
And the only reason we even had them, as I understand it, was to pay for the war.
Yeah, it was a good first attempt, but it was the reason Washington didn't like the Articles of Confederation, which were technically in place before the end of the Revolutionary War. They guided us during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
Is because from his perspective as the commander in chief, he saw that we didn't have any strong federal government with a federal army.
Right.
And the method was each state would send up their militia. And of course, every able-bodied male was a member of the militia, technically. in every state. And so it was a horrible system. I think that, you know, with the help of the French, and more specifically through divine guidance and God's hand, we won the Revolutionary War, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, I was not aware of that, but I'm glad to know that because it's an interesting point of view that points out George Washington. I did a podcast on the founding fathers and religion. In fact, I think I ended up having to split it into 2 sessions. The same with the founding fathers and slavery. And I think I split that into 2 sessions too. So I'm aware of some of this stuff through my research on that. You there, Richard?
I am.
You just went blank. Started again. Yeah, because you went blank on me for a second. I don't know what I did.
I don't know what happened.
I don't know either. But anyway, we can, like I say, I got some really good editing software. It was free. Which of Washington's virtues that he displayed most prominently?
It's a good question. The answer that I give almost exclusively when I get any version of that question is his integrity. So we get the word integrity from a math term. Now, I go into some detail in the book about how bad I am at math, but I did learn in my remedial math classes in college that an integer is a whole number.
Right.
It's not a fraction. It's not a decimal. It's a whole number. And so we get the word integrity from the word integer, which means whole. And so Washington was not divided in his morals or in his virtues. He was a whole person, meaning that he acted in a way that fully reflected his beliefs for the most part. Now, he wasn't divine, obviously, he was a human. But among us fallen mortals, especially during that time period, Washington exhibited integrity. One of the stories I tell that really point out his integrity was when he was selected to be the commander in chief. So Washington, I mentioned earlier, never really said much. But there was one day during the Constitutional Convention when Washington shows up with his Virginia militia uniform on. He just starts attending the meetings with his uniform on. He didn't say anything to anyone. He didn't make a grandiose gesture. He didn't ask for the press to meet him so that he could explain it. He simply said to all the other people at the Constitutional Convention, in my mind, the only way to break with England is to go to war, and I'm going to put my uniform on. And if you decide to use me, great. But I'm going to be the first to volunteer to break with England. Now, you and I can just talk about this and sort of shrug our shoulders and say, so what? But what this means, Dale, is that he would have been the first to commit outright treason in terms of saying that he was ready to go to war with the king. So when he was asked to be the head of the Revolutionary Army, he said yes, but in his private letters to his wife, Martha, Washington said if there was any other way, he would rather them pick anyone but him. But he said, because my friends need me, I said yes. So Washington expressed to Martha what he did not express publicly, which was he wasn't just itching to fight, and he wasn't just itching to be the guy in charge. But what he was doing was he was making himself available, and he was saying that even if they ask me to do something I don't want to do, I'm going to do it because they need me, and this cause is bigger than just me. So that's just one example. Yeah. But I think you could sum it up by saying that, generally speaking, when you talk about George Washington, he knew what was right and he did what was right in most of the cases.
I knew that he wore his uniform to the Constitutional Conventions, but I had heard or read somewhere along the lines in my years of studying, and I'm a big history buff. I love history, all the way from Alley-oop, if you remember him, up to today. But what I had read is that he wore it elegantly. that he was going to be in charge, and that's just all there was to it. It's the reason he wore his uniform. And I believe your story a lot better than that one, knowing what I know about George Washington. All right.
So that's a really good point. And I think I understand why people say that. Because if you're not careful, if you read my book, and I do say in my book that Washington was a very, he was entrepreneurial. He was very aggressive. He was a business person, right? He was in business. He wanted to be number one. So he was that kind of person that believed in himself. You kind of have to be a little bit to think that you can lead an army. But based on my research, I would say that yes, Washington was expressing confidence. I wouldn't say arrogance. I would say Washington was expressing confidence, but you can be confident and you can be humble at the same time. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, right? And so I think some people take it as arrogance, but I think based on what we know about George Washington and the way he lived his life, there's a greater chance that he was expressing confident humility than he was expressing arrogance, just in my opinion.
And I agree with your opinion on that, Richard, because of what I know about Washington in my research for the book on religion and the book on his slave ownership, not my book, but my podcast on those, that he was a very humble man.
Oh yeah, he was. I mean, his exterior persona was very humble, and he didn't have to be because he was so much bigger than everybody else. It was, he was 5 inches or so taller than the average person, and so he didn't have to be humble. When he walked into a room, he sucked all the oxygen out of it because he was such a commanding presence.
Yeah,
but he was humble, and he was, like I said, you can be confident in your humility without being arrogant. And that is the way, just based on my research, that I would define George Washington.
And I would agree with that definition 100%. You got one of the, I wrote down, copied all the questions the questions that Richard Raines was always ready to answer. And I may not ask them in the way, ask them in the way that you wrote them. But the one that really strikes my fancy right now is we don't hear much about his failures. What makes that so?
That's a good question, Dale. So Washington's very first real experience as a military leader was during the French and Indian War, which he started. He started that war. He fired on the French first. So he was given command of a small fort. He got there, the fort was run down, the men were disorganized, and so he started trying to put the fort together and make sure that everything was stocked and that the men were ready. But he would go out and he would go hunting for the French during that time, and he would go himself to the Native Americans, to the Indians, and try to strike deals, which none of them struck a deal with him. And so he bragged about how ready that he was for any attack on his fort. And so at Fort Necessity, that was the name of the fort.
Oh yeah,
and
now I know.
When you look at European warfare, the way that Europeans would fight each other was they would meet in an open battlefield and just shoot at each other until eventually they ran at each other with bayonets, and just whoever was left standing at the end was the winner. And so Washington had the battlefield cleared. He had the area cleared where they were going to engage the enemy. And so started raining one morning. And as the rain was falling, all of his powder was getting wet, and his men were beginning to drink, and the French and the Indians attacked. Only they didn't attack from an open field like good Europeans were supposed to do. They were fighting behind rocks and trees and cover. And so they fought all day. Washington lost a third of his men. He was out of gunpowder. The men had broken into the rum and they were getting drunk, and it was over. Like they were all going to die. And so someone hand delivered a wet note to Colonel Washington saying that they could surrender if they would agree to leave. Now, he didn't have a good interpreter, and so what the French were saying is, if you agree to leave and never return to this area, which Washington didn't have the authority to do anyway. But so George Washington took 2/3 of his men that were still alive and left with his life. Now, 1/3 of the men under his command died because of his arrogance, because he was not prepared, and because he thought that because he was who he would certainly win. But 1/3 of his men left orphaned children and widowed wives. And so what Washington learned from that, which was a monumental failure, Dale, that almost disqualified him from military service under the crown. It didn't, because of what happened really next in his career, but it almost disqualified him. But did you know that when he failed at Fort Necessity, for the rest of his military career, he never surrendered again, because he took the lessons from Fort Necessity. So the point that I try to make is that Washington failed and he learned from his failure. So what I want us to take from that, Dale, is that we need to start embracing failure as part of the process of moving forward. And one of the stories I tell to highlight that is we all probably have a can of WD-40 underneath our kitchen sink or somewhere in the garage.
Yeah.
And WD stands for water displacement, and 40 stands for 40th formulation. That means that a product that it is estimated that over 90% of American households have currently in their home, what you're holding, the can that you're holding is failed 39 times. And I tell people that I bet there was a time in history when the guy who developed WD-40 kissed his wife goodbye, held up WD-23 and said, "This is it, honey. We're going to be rich." Right? But he had to fail 39 times. And so the point that I try to make is that we have become averse to failure. We give kids participation trophies. We tell everybody they're great and everybody's a winner, and we don't keep score at basketball games and all this dumb stuff.
Yeah.
And it's because we're so averse to failure. But what we need to understand is failure is not just something that is probably going to happen. Failure is how you learn. Anybody that has kids that got in the front yard and threw a baseball with them knows that when a kid starts throwing a baseball, that the dad spends more time chasing the baseball than he does catching the baseball, because kids have to fail at throwing the baseball before they can learn to be ace pitchers, or before they can throw it from the outfield to second base and get the runner out. Yeah. So failure is a part of the process, and Washington really demonstrated that. And I think it's a lesson that we can learn from his life.
Yeah, my kids were young when they first started some of that nonsense, and I refused to allow it. Up until my divorce, I don't know if my ex-wife at that time continued that practice, but it was sure good for my sons. I got 3 very wonderful boys who were very not ingenious, but, well, one of them's a genius, but they're good kids, really good kids. So, and that's part of the reason is I let them fail.
You have to.
Yeah, my son fell off the horses, get back on the darn thing, literally.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so the average person, I think, knows this, but as a society, we think that failure disqualifies you. And so, when I owned my own business for a long time, I was a CEO of a medical services corporation. And when I would hire people, I would ask them, tell me about a time you failed and how you responded to it. And people are so taken back by that question because they're not expected to talk about failure.
No,
you're expected to put this persona on, like you can, that you can, beat a cheetah in a phone booth with one hand tied behind your back. But the reality is I would imagine, Dale, when you started doing this podcast, there were probably a lot of the first episodes where you think, man, I didn't know what the heck I was doing, and I had to fail at it before I got good at it. It's just a part of the process. I mean, there are chapters in this book. There are chapters in this book that hopefully your readers, your listeners will go by. There are chapters in this book that never made it to the book because they were awful.
Yeah.
Because I failed at it. And so I think that we have to learn that.
Yeah. Yeah. If you go back and listen to some of my early podcasts, they were bad. However, I persevered. I learned from my mistakes. I did nothing but audio for a long time. Now I'm doing the videos with my interviews because I think I get more out of it. And because I'm such a history buff, I interview a lot of people that I can get history from, because they've got a history and you have a history. And I like what you're talking about with participation stuff and, and your faith. I think that's important. What's your favorite historical story about George?
Favorite story is after his failure at Fort Necessity, he started the war. The British come over to fight the French and Indian War. And General Braddock, who is a British general, despises Washington, thinks he's a failure. He's a dumb colonist that started this war. And essentially, he didn't demote Washington's rank, but essentially he told Washington, you're going to accompany me through this war, and you're just going to serve me. You're going to be my aide. The official title was aide de camp.
Yeah.
So they start off through the forest. Braddock has these redcoats marching through the forest, and Washington is begging Braddock, please don't march these redcoats through this forest. They don't fight like you think we're supposed to fight. Braddock says, thanks. I'll file that in the drawer that says, don't listen to anything George Washington says. So they get to a place called the Monongahela River, and the British are clearing a road, and the French and the Indians attack, just like they attacked Fort Necessity, from behind trees, behind rocks, and it's like shooting fish in a barrel. And so before that battle, Braddock told Washington, your job is to serve me. Your first priority is to serve me as an aide de camp. So the bullets start flying, and General Braddock is shot almost immediately, but he doesn't die. He's off of his horse. Bullets are flying. The British are running for their life. Washington doesn't grab his gun. He doesn't run. He gets off of his horse and he drags Braddock to safety and starts taking care of Braddock. Braddock kind of comes to his senses, and he looks around. He doesn't see any officers. All the officers are running. The closest thing he sees to an officer is a Virginia militia colonel, George Washington. And he says to him, get on your horse and rally a defense. George Washington gets on his horse, and for the rest of that day, for 12 hours, George Washington fights from the back of a horse, leads the British to actually going from running for their lives. He gathers the troops. They attack again. They attack the French and the Indians and drive them away from Monongahela. And after 12 hours of fighting, Washington ends the day with 3 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullet holes in his coat. Mm-hmm. Now, years later, and this is part of that same story, years later, after the French and Indian War, Washington and a good friend of his were traveling in the Ohio River Valley, the area where Monongahela was. And they were scoping out some land that Washington was granted because of his service in the French and Indian War, to see if it was something they needed to sell, or they could maybe farm it or grow timber or whatever. And while he was there, he got a notice that the Native American chiefs in the area wanted to meet him. So he agrees to sit down with them. And while he's meeting with these Native American Indian chiefs, they tell him that they all know who he was, because they were there at the Battle of Monongahela, and they all trained their rifles on him, and no one could hit him. And so here's what happened. After the Battle of Monongahela, the Native Americans go back to their tribes, tell the story of George Washington. And then the Native American religious leaders issue a prophecy about George Washington, saying that this man would one day lead a great nation that did not yet exist. Now, Washington never told that story, but his friend told it. And after Washington's death, there were plays that were written about that event. So let me just put that into historical perspective for you, Dale. The Native Americans issuing a prophecy about George Washington is the equivalent to the Germans in World War II going back to their base after D-Day and writing songs about an American officer on the beach at Normandy. Mm-hmm. That's the equivalent of that, because they were enemies at the time. So, so that, and there's a lot more to that, but that is my favorite George Washington story.
Yeah.
So,
I knew about having, I thought 3 horses, though, were part of the Revolutionary story, not the French and Indian story.
Yep, it's part of the for French and Indian. It happened at the Battle of Monongahela, and
Yeah.
the point that I make there about that story for the book is George Washington understood servant leadership. The thing that we take away from that story that I think is um, so great is that Washington was the most competent person on the battlefield to understand the enemy.
Hmm.
He was relegated to a position where he had to serve General Braddock.
Yeah.
And when the bullets started flying, even though George Washington was the most competent person on that battlefield, he became the aide de camp of the century. And he took care of Braddock and
Yep.
he served Braddock until Braddock said, okay, go be a soldier. And then he was the best soldier on the battlefield. So impressive that the enemy issued a religious prophecy about him. But first thing he did was he served Braddock. And I
Yeah.
think what we need to renew in our culture is we need to renew the idea of servant leadership, leaders who serve. Now, you and I are Christians, and we maybe understand this a little better because we understand that when Jesus came, Jesus flipped society on its head, and he
Boy,
said
he
things
did.
like, "If you want to live, you got to die.
Yeah.
If you want to, if you want to, if you want to be served, you have to serve." And so we understand that from a from a Christian perspective, and certainly that was what I think informed George Washington. But that's my favorite story.
Yeah, I think it's a great story. I had not heard that one. I knew about the shooting of the horses, but I thought it was in the Revolutionary War, the 4 bullets in his coat and stuff. So I had that part wrong, but I knew about the battle. That he, I didn't know he was played such a pivotal role in bringing them together to rally the English troops. Can you dispel any myths of Washington besides throwing the coin across the Potomac?
I don't
Down the
think that
territory.
there's a few that there. So when Washington died, people started making up stories about him to sell books.
Mm-hmm.
So we get a few stories. We get the tossing the coin across the Potomac. I don't know that that's a true story. That he chopped down a cherry tree when he was a kid. That's a made up story.
It is.
But the interesting thing, Dale, is you really didn't have to make up any stories because the guy was the closest thing to Superman that these people had ever seen. And I'm
Yeah.
not making that up. He would,
No.
his officers were constantly complaining about him. And the thing they complained about was that he was the general of the whole army and he would fight from his horse with no regard for his own safety. There's
No.
more than one story about George Washington finding himself on his horse in front of his army chasing the enemy.
Yeah.
Like just him, like just one man on his horse trying to take on the whole British army. And you have to say, you have to say that it was the hand of Providence that this guy didn't get killed because of just no regard for his own safety. And it showed up time and time again. It was a story. It was a recurring story.
Mm-hmm. George Washington, as we know, owned slaves since he was 14 when his father died.
Right.
So he was bequeathed some slaves, not a bunch, but some. I don't remember how many. I'd have to look at my notes on my podcast, but he had owned slaves for many, many years. And when he died, he freed them, but it took a year for them to get free, according to the research I went through. After he passed away, because he died right at the end of the year, in December or something, I believe.
So in his will, so he did free one of his slaves. It ended up being one of his best friends in the world. It was somebody that accompanied him.
Yeah.
It was, and the name escapes me, and I don't have it in my notes. I think I mentioned him in the book.
Yeah.
But when he died, he stated that all the slaves were to be freed when Martha died.
Mm-hmm.
So the slaves weren't free until Martha died, except for that one slave that was really as close as any friend could be. He was still a slave though, but he was Washington's personal assistant.
Yeah, I don't know who you're talking about. I can't remember the name either, but I see who I got things messed up because I remember that there would be slaves when Martha was free. And he was the only founding father to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, John Adams was the only founding father, besides his son, John Quincy, that did not own slaves.
Right,
And Washington was the only one that freed his slaves.
right. But so it was, you know, they say people, well, you can't be virtuous and own slaves in today's culture, which I think a lot depends on the time of the year. I mean, the culture that he lived in, the time that he lived in, doesn't, I don't think the two equate, in my opinion. But you can be virtuous and own slaves. I think they equate. I think they work together.
So that's a point that a lot of people bring up, and I address it in the book because I'm a historian and I'm not interested in telling a story that fits my narrative. I'm interested in telling the story, which is the historical story.
Right.
And so you would have people that would say today that we should tear all statues down of George Washington. We should cancel George Washington because he owned slaves. And there's a lot that I have to say about that, and I'll kind of sum it up, but here's one of the things I say. Okay, if we are going to tear down statues of founding fathers because they own slaves, because slavery is it's the one thing you can't do in history to survive, just survive the history books. You have to be completely wiped out of history. So so if we're going to do that, then let's do it. But let's be comprehensive about it. So, for instance, if you are a man and you are listening to this podcast and you think that all slave owners should be canceled from history, and you view internet pornography, then you are doing more to put money in the pockets of human traffickers, which is slavery, than anything George Washington ever did. There are 24 million people, women and children, who are currently trafficked in the world. All right, so let's don't stop there. Right now, if you have an electronic device, or you have anything in your home, or if you have an automobile with electronic parts, if you have anything that was made in China, there are currently 3.8 million slaves in China endorsed by the Chinese government. So what you need to do is you need to drag everything out into the yard and burn it. Your car, your iPhone, your computer, because if we're going to do it, let's do it.
Yeah.
So there were about 12 million transatlantic slaves.
Right.
388,000 or so came to the U.S., but those came from Angola, Congo, other West African countries where you had black African kings rounding up Africans, and these Africans were on the beach waiting for the Europeans. So we need to cancel those countries. No more trade with those countries. No more. You don't issue any passports or visas to or from those countries unless you. All right. So you have part of the religion of Islam is, you can own slaves in Islam, and so we have to cut off all trade, all dealings with any country that supports Islam, right? So if we're going to do it, let's just do it. Well, that's not what these woke leftists want to do. What they want to do is they just want to cancel anything that makes us think that America is anything but a horrible place. They just want America to be a horrible place. So let's just put it into historical context. George Washington owned slaves. That is a despicable smudge mark on his life and on his character. He failed himself, he failed his slaves, and he failed future Americans by not doing something about slavery before he died. Because he came to understand that slavery was wrong, and he never did anything about it. Now, he put forward solutions that never really took hold. Like, for instance, he and Lafayette bought land in the West Indies, and their idea was to send all the slaves to the West Indies, give them property, let them share crop property, let them be free, and make their own way and get them out of slavery. That was his idea, but it didn't take hold.
Yeah.
To a large extent, Washington was a man of his time.
Yep.
Slavery was a complicated issue. A lot like abortion is a very complicated issue for us. And I tell a story in the book that I think highlights how complicated the issue is. There was a slave. Her name was Phyllis Wheatley, and Phyllis Wheatley was a poet in New England. And she loved George Washington, and she wrote a poem thanking God for George Washington and asking God to guide him and protect him. And so here you have a slave. She was a former slave when she wrote this, but you have a slave writing a poem thanking God for a slave owner. Now, what that means is it is a complicated issue that fits within a very complicated historical timeline. And while you can look back on it and you can say slavery was wrong and those people that owned slaves failed America, they failed the slaves, they failed themselves, without saying that one issue defines everything they ever did or thought or said.
Right.
And that's my perspective on slavery.
And Phyllis Wheatley, I remember her because I have her in my podcast, and there's no record of those two meeting, but George Washington knew about her.
He did. He was a fan of her books. He was a big fan of her.
Yes.
And
so he knew about it.
Yeah.
And, I agree with you. And also when Jefferson wrote the Constitution originally, he had outlawed slavery in it, and the southern states fought him so bad and fought it so bad they had to put in how does it that one phrase?
They were a fifth of a person for
the
population.
The 1/5 the compromise.
That's right. Yeah,
and that's
the Virginia Compromise. Yeah,
Virginia, and that was come from the southern states because they were so ingrained. It was so a part of their culture and so a part of their
economy.
It
was part of their economy, Dale. It was for let's just look at it, academically for just a second. Let's try not to look at the moral failure of it. It didn't take very long for slavery to be such a part of the Southern economy that if you were to just take all the slaves away at one time, it would have crashed the Southern economy. Now, you can argue that's the small price to pay for the freedom of another person. So we're not arguing the morality of it. We're just arguing the
economics,
sort of the economic reality of it. Slavery is wrong, obviously, and I tell people all the time that Republicans had to go to war with Democrats to take their slaves away from them, and we fought a war, right? Like white people went to war with other whites. Look, the majority of who did not own slaves, right, to end slavery. And it took a war, and it divided this nation. And it would have been better for us if George Washington and the founding fathers would have eradicated slavery, or at least set forth a plan to eradicate slavery in the Constitution. But they didn't, and it's cost us ever since.
Yes,
it's been a problem ever since.
Because that's where the division started. And you're right about the Democrats. Although, in my personal opinion, you claim to be a Democrat, you can claim to be a Republican, and being that there ain't a lick of difference between the two of you.
Well, opinion. These days it's certainly hard to tell the difference.
Yes, that's what I say. I mean, I'm not a Republican by any stretch of imagination because of that. You make the distinction in the book between character and integrity. Can you explain the difference?
So integrity, as we said earlier, is this wholeness, this undivided morality. Character is integrity in action.
Yeah.
So integrity is who I am, and character is what I do. If that makes sense, that's about the briefest, simplest definition I can give it to. And Washington expressed character. He did what was right.
Yeah, I tend to make an effort to do that. Now I wear my cross on the outside of my shirt, not so you're gonna know I'm a Christian. So I want to know I'm a Christian. And if I'm going to claim to be anyone and wear this cross, I've done well, I'd better be acting like one.
For sure. Or take it off.
Yeah, take it off. And there are people who weren't, just to say, well, I'm a, and there's precedence for that in the Old Testament. And I don't remember where it was, but they're talking about the wearing their skull caps.
Hmm.
And he said, we weren't not so you'll know I'm a, and God is talking to one of the prophets about it. I believe is how it goes. It says, you're not wearing it to say you love me. You're wearing it so you know you love me. That other people, and you better act like one. And there's precedence in it. We found doing EFM is when we found it.
Hmm. Okay.
So there's precedence for me doing this in the Bible. I just got to find it again.
Yeah, I'd have to search for that. That doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah,
But-
I'd have to search for it. But
So there's one other, before we wrap it up, Dale, there's
Yeah.
one other virtue that I want to share with the
of course,
listeners,
be my guest.
is that, and I go through the various virtues, failure and how he responded to failure. I talk
Yeah.
about integrity and conviction and inspiration and empathy and courage. But at the end of the Constitutional Convention, before the Virginia Compromise that you and I just talked about, the southern states and northern states couldn't get through this. It was an impasse, and they couldn't get around it. So Washington, as the president of the Constitutional Convention, stands up and he says this, and this is what I want to leave your listeners. George Washington said, "To please all is impossible, and to attempt it would be in vain. The only way, therefore, is to form such a government as will bear the scrutinizing eye of criticism." And here's where we come in, Dale. "And trust it to good sense and patriotism of the people to carry it into effect." George Washington had hope. And his hope was that we would recognize the hand of providence the way that he recognized it. And providence was just another name for God,
Yep.
for him. But Washington had hope. So when I look around, I see how far our culture has fallen. And I see the violence, and I see the division, and I see the over sexualization of everything.
Yes.
But I have hope in God, and I have hope that people will come to their senses, because that's what George Washington had. He had hope in future generations that they would do what was right, even if it was hard.
Yes.
And so that is sort of my biggest point in the book, is that the decisions that we have to make are extremely difficult, but the hard decisions are almost always the right decisions. And we've got to change the narrative, and we have to do things and say things and write things that put our country back on the right track, both morally and culturally, and I would say even politically, and then trust that the future generations will pick up our banner and keep moving. So of all the virtues that Washington expressed, the fact that we end the book on hope means that there's more to be written, and we're the ones that have to write it. So as bad as things are, it ain't over till it's over.
No, and I totally agree. In fact, as I say in my intro to my podcast, that the culture that forgets its history has no future.
Oh, for sure.
So we have to keep that in mind, in my opinion, and bring people back to the faith. So anyway, it is time, I'm afraid, much as I hate to, because I've enjoyed our conversation so much, Richard.
Well, I have too. And so the book is available. So the title of the book is Finding Washington, Why America Needs to Rediscover the Virtues of Her Most Essential Founding Father. A lot of humor, a lot of history, a lot of discussion about how we can change the moral tide in our country. And you can buy the book, Dale. Your listeners can buy it anywhere online books are sold. Books and Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, Amazon. I would encourage your readers to either get the Kindle version or the paperback. Both of those are less than $10.
Yeah.
If you know anything about writing books, authors don't make a lot on writing books.
No.
But I didn't write this to make money. I wrote this to start a conversation in America and inspire people to begin doing things that George Washington did uh, to turn the tide in our culture. So if you're a parent and you're concerned about the world your kids live in, or a grandparent and you look and see how horrible things are, or if you're just like me, you're somebody that looks around and sees how bad it is, and this book
Yeah.
is for you. And I hope that you'll get it, and I hope that you'll send me an email. I give my email throughout the book. It's richard@findingwashington.com.
Okay.
And send me an email. Let me know what you think, and let's change things together. But thank you so much for having me, Dale. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I really appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. And by the way, the tagline for this podcast is exposing the truth.
Exposing the truth. I like it.
So anyway, you have a great rest of your day and enjoy your class. And I will get this published in about 2 weeks.
All right, Dale, listen, I really appreciate it, man. If you ever need me for anything, if you find yourself needing a guest and can't find anybody, send me an email and we'll find something to talk about, okay?
All right, we can talk about faith next time.
Sounds good to me. You have a great day, my friend.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the show. There are show notes and a place to comment at https://coffee-time-again.libsyn.com/website. He hopes that you liked what you heard and will tell others about him. Dale is attempting to get a following that both disagrees and agrees with him. He does not want yes men. If you disagree, wonderful. He is happy to have you here as a part of the Coffee Time Again team. Dale does not talk about the news of the day. He is attempting to give a history lesson that is just as important about what is going on in the headlines of today. Please do not hesitate to contact him. Just remember that Dale wants a clean show, meaning no cussing, name calling, yelling, or hate allowed. You can disagree with him and not be disagreeable about it. Support him and help keep this alive. https://glow.fm/coffee-time-again.